What if every salary negotiation you have ever lost, every deal you have ever left money on, and every difficult conversation you have ever handled poorly came down to one fundamental mistake? The assumption that negotiation is a rational exchange of logical arguments rather than an emotional, psychological human encounter. Most people enter negotiations armed with facts, figures, and a fair position, and then wonder why the other side does not simply agree. Chris Voss wrote Never Split the Difference to dismantle that assumption completely and replace it with something far more powerful. Chris Voss is not a business professor or a management consultant. He is a former FBI hostage negotiator who spent 24 years negotiating in situations where failure meant someone died. As the FBI's lead international kidnapping negotiator, he developed and tested a system of tactical communication in the highest stakes environments imaginable, then spent years applying those same tools in boardrooms, salary negotiations, and business deals across every industry. The result is a negotiation framework unlike anything taught in business schools, built not on rationality but on the science of human emotion and psychological influence. By the time this analysis ends, you will understand why splitting the difference is one of the worst negotiation moves available to you. How to use empathy as a precision instrument of influence. How to make the other side feel heard while simultaneously moving them toward your outcome, and how a single calibrated question can shift the entire dynamic of a negotiation in your favor. Subscribe to the Book Vault right now, hit the like button, and share this with someone building a financially intelligent life. We are building toward 100 subscribers, and every share strengthens this community. The strategic breakdown. The new rules. We begin where Voss begins, with a foundational argument that dismantles everything most people think they know about negotiation, and he frames it as the new rules. For decades, the dominant negotiation framework was built on the assumption that human beings are rational actors who respond to logical arguments and fair proposals. The Harvard method of principled negotiation, codified in the classic book, Getting to Yes, taught negotiators to separate people from problems, focus on interests rather than positions, and seek mutually beneficial outcomes through reason. Voss spent his career discovering why this approach consistently fails in the real world. The FBI's experience, accumulated across thousands of hostage situations, revealed a truth that academia had been slow to accept. People do not make decisions through rational analysis. They make decisions through emotion and then justify those decisions with logic after the fact. A hostage taker does not respond to a logical argument about why releasing their captive is in their best interest. They respond to whether they feel heard, understood, and respected. And a business counterpart sitting across a negotiating table is operating from the same emotional architecture, even when the stakes involve contracts rather than lives. Voss replaces the rational model with something he calls tactical empathy, the disciplined practice of understanding the other side's perspective and emotional state and then using that understanding to influence the direction of the negotiation. This is not soft or sentimental. It is one of the most precise and most powerful tools in any negotiator's arsenal. The person across the table from you is not an obstacle to overcome with logic. They are a human being with fears, pressures, and needs that, once understood and addressed, become the very levers that move the negotiation in your direction. Be a mirror, the first tactical skill Voss introduces as one of the simplest and most immediately effective in the entire book, and he calls it mirroring. The technique itself requires almost nothing. When the other person says something important, you repeat the last 1 to 3 words of what they just said, with a slight upward inflection, as if you were curious rather than challenging. Then you stay silent and let them continue. That is the entire technique, and in practice, it consistently produces one of the most valuable things you can get in any negotiation, which is more information from the other side without revealing anything about your own position. Voss describes using this technique during a bank robbery negotiation where the suspect demanded a getaway helicopter. Rather than immediately arguing against the request, the negotiator simply mirrored it back. A helicopter. The suspect kept talking. He revealed his actual fears and his actual priorities, which turned out to be entirely different from the stated demand. That information became the foundation of the resolution. Mirroring works because it signals deep attention without resistance, and most people, when they feel genuinely listened to, will fill the silence by elaborating on exactly the things you most need to understand. Do not feel their pain. Label it the chapter that follows. Introduces what Voss considers one of the most powerful single techniques in his entire system, and he calls it labeling. Where mirroring is about repeating, labeling is about naming. Specifically, it is the discipline of identifying the emotion or perspective underneath what the other person is expressing and naming it out loud, carefully and tentatively. The formula is simple. It seems like something is bothering you about this. It sounds like you feel this is unfair. It looks like this is more complicated than it might appear. Those phrases, used precisely, do something extraordinary in a negotiation. They make the other person feel deeply understood, which immediately reduces their defensiveness and opens them to genuine dialogue. Voss is precise about why labeling works at a neurological level. When a negative emotion is named accurately, the activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, measurably decreases. The other person becomes less reactive, less defensive, and more cognitively flexible. This is not manipulation. It is the skillful application of how human neuroscience actually functions. The negotiator who labels effectively is not pretending to care about the other person's emotional state. They are genuinely attending to it, and that genuine attending produces real psychological safety that makes resolution possible. Beware. Yes, master no one of the most counterintuitive ideas in the entire book arrives in the chapter where Voss argues that the word yes is often the most dangerous word in a negotiation, and that the word no can be the most productive one. Most negotiators are trained to pursue yes relentlessly, to build agreement incrementally, to get the other side nodding along until the final yes feels inevitable. Voss spent his career discovering why this approach backfires. A yes extracted prematurely is almost always a counterfeit. Yes, an agreement made to end the discomfort of the conversation rather than a genuine commitment to follow through. It creates the illusion of progress while producing none. No, by contrast, signals something real. When someone says no to a proposal, they are telling you exactly where the boundary of their comfort lies. They are giving you genuine information about what they will not accept, which is the most useful information in any negotiation. Voss teaches negotiators to actively invite no by asking questions framed around the other side's autonomy. Have you given up on finding a solution that works for both of us? That question, asked in the right moment, almost always produces a no, followed by a renewed engagement, because no one wants to be the person who gave up on a good outcome. Trigger, the two words, the chapter that builds toward what Voss calls the most powerful two words in negotiation, that is right, reveals one of the most precise psychological tools in the entire book. There is a critical difference between a counterpart saying you are right and saying that is right. When someone says you are right, they are often trying to end the conversation. They are conceding the point to get relief from the pressure of the exchange, but when someone says that is right, something different has happened. They have genuinely recognized that you understand their situation, their perspective, and their needs. That recognition is the foundation of genuine agreement rather than superficial compliance. Voss describes the technique for triggering that is right as a combination of active listening, labeling, and summary. You listen carefully, you label the emotions underneath what the other person is expressing, and then you paraphrase their perspective back to them so accurately and so completely that they cannot help but feel genuinely understood. The summary is not a manipulation, it is a demonstration of genuine comprehension, and when it lands correctly, the response is almost always, "That is right," followed by a shift in the dynamic of the entire negotiation toward collaborative problem-solving rather than positional combat. Bend their reality. We now arrive at one of the most strategically rich chapters in the book. The chapter Voss builds around the concept of bending reality, which is his term for the set of techniques that shape how the other side perceives the value and fairness of a proposal. The most powerful tool in this chapter is what Voss calls anchoring, specifically extreme anchoring. The research on anchoring is among the most robust in behavioral economics. Whatever number is introduced first in a negotiation exerts a disproportionate pull on everything that follows, even when both parties know intellectually that the anchor is arbitrary. The negotiator who controls the anchor controls the frame of the entire conversation. Voss teaches negotiators to use an extreme anchor not as their opening offer, but as a range, and specifically a range whose lower number is still above their actual target. If you want a salary of $80,000, you do not open at $80,000. You present a range where $80,000 is the low end. The other side's attention immediately gravitates toward the lower number of the range, which feels more reasonable by comparison. And you have simultaneously established that anything below $80,000 is outside the discussion entirely. This single technique, applied correctly, shifts the entire negotiating range without a single argument being made. The power of loss aversion is another tool Voss deploys in this chapter with surgical precision. People feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining an equivalent thing. This asymmetry means that framing a proposal in terms of what the other side stands to lose if they do not agree is consistently more persuasive than framing it in terms of what they stand to gain if they do, not as a threat, but as a genuine articulation of the cost of inaction. The negotiator who understands loss aversion and uses it ethically holds one of the most powerful psychological levers available in any high-stakes exchange. Calibrated Questions, the chapter that follows, introduces the single most versatile tool in the entire Voss negotiation system, and he calls them calibrated questions. A calibrated question is an open-ended question that begins with how or what and is designed to make the other side do your work for you. The most powerful calibrated question in the book is one that Voss uses in virtually every high-stakes situation. How am I supposed to do that? That question, delivered calmly and without aggression, accomplishes several things simultaneously. It acknowledges the other side's position without accepting it, it invites them to solve your problem, and it forces them to engage with the constraints of your reality rather than simply pressing harder on their demand. Voss recounts using calibrated questions in a kidnapping negotiation where the kidnappers were demanding a ransom the family could not pay, rather than stating the constraint directly, which would have produced immediate escalation. The negotiator asked what the kidnappers suggested the family do to raise funds they did not have. That question shifted the burden of problem-solving onto the kidnappers, who gradually moderated their demands as they engaged with the reality of what was actually achievable. Calibrated questions work in business negotiations through the same mechanism. They engage the other side's intelligence and creativity in solving your problem rather than simply fighting against your position. Guarantee execution. The final chapter of the strategic breakdown addresses the failure mode that destroys more negotiated agreements than any other, and Voss frames it around the discipline of guaranteeing execution. Reaching an agreement in a negotiation is not the finish line. It is the beginning of the real challenge, which is ensuring that the agreement is actually implemented. Voss argues that most negotiators focus all their energy on reaching yes and almost none on the mechanics of following through. The result is agreements that look complete on paper and collapse in execution because the real obstacles were never addressed. The tool Voss introduces for guaranteeing execution is a specific kind of follow-up questioning that he calls the implementation conversation. After an agreement is reached, you ask a calibrated question about execution. How will we know this is working? What happens if something comes up that makes this difficult to implement? Who else needs to be on board for this to actually happen? These questions are not expressions of distrust. They are the disciplined practice of surfacing the obstacles that will inevitably arise and addressing them while the goodwill of a fresh agreement still exists. The negotiator who has this conversation is the negotiator whose deals actually close. Key lessons and insights. Tactical empathy is the most powerful negotiation tool available. The first lesson this book teaches, and the one that reframes everything else, is that empathy in negotiation is not a soft virtue, but a precision instrument of influence. Voss shows us that the negotiator who genuinely understands the other side's emotional state and communicates that understanding clearly and accurately consistently outperforms the negotiator who relies on logic, data, and rational argument. Tactical empathy does not mean agreeing with the other side. It means demonstrating that you understand their perspective well enough to name it accurately, which reduces defensiveness and opens the path to genuine agreement. Apply this lesson this week in any difficult conversation you are anticipating. Before presenting your position, spend the first several minutes doing nothing but listening and labeling. Name what you observe in the other person's tone and body language. It seems like this situation has been frustrating. It sounds like there is more pressure here than might be visible. Let them confirm or correct your labels. The information that emerges from that exchange will tell you more about how to move the negotiation forward than any amount of preparation based on logic alone. No is the beginning of a real negotiation, not the end. The second lesson Voss delivers with field-tested authority is that pursuing yes relentlessly is one of the most common and most costly mistakes in negotiation. A premature yes is almost always counterfeit, an agreement made to end discomfort rather than to commit to action. No, by contrast, is the most honest word in negotiation because it signals a real boundary. When someone says no, they are giving you genuine information about where their limits lie, which is exactly the information you need to find a proposal they will actually follow through on. Practice reframing no as information rather than rejection in your next negotiation. When you hear it, resist the instinct to argue or retreat. Instead, ask a calibrated question. It sounds like this does not work for you as it stands. What would need to change for this to make sense? That question invites the other side to define the path forward on their own terms, which produces a far more durable agreement than anything you could have argued them into accepting. Calibrated questions put the other side to work for you. The third lesson embedded throughout this book is that the negotiator who asks the right questions consistently outperforms the negotiator who makes the best arguments. Calibrated how and what questions engage the other side's intelligence in solving your problem. Force them to confront the constraints of reality rather than simply pressing on their position, and produce the kind of collaborative problem-solving that arguments never can. The question, how am I supposed to do that, is worth more in most negotiations than any counterargument ever devised, because it makes the other person a partner in your problem rather than an adversary to your position. Begin building your calibrated question vocabulary this week. Before any significant conversation or negotiation, prepare 3 how or what questions that, if answered honestly, would give you the information you most need. What makes this timeline feel necessary? How would we handle it if circumstances changed? What would success actually look like for you in this situation? Those questions, asked with genuine curiosity rather than tactical aggression, will produce more useful intelligence and more genuine movement than any number of persuasive arguments you could have prepared instead. Anchor extreme to control the entire frame. The fourth lesson Voss delivers is one of the most immediately deployable tactical insights in the book for anyone involved in salary negotiations, deal-making, or any high-stakes financial conversation. The first number introduced in a negotiation exerts a disproportionate influence on everything that follows. The negotiator who controls the anchor controls the psychological frame of the entire exchange. By anchoring extreme, presenting a range whose lowest number is still above your actual target, you simultaneously establish a high baseline and make any number within your range feel like a reasonable concession. Practice anchoring deliberately in your next negotiation by preparing your extreme range in advance. Know what your ideal outcome is, and then construct a range whose lower bound equals your ideal. Present that range with confidence and then stay silent. Watch where the other side anchors their response. The gap between your range and their response defines the negotiating space, and because you anchored high, that space will consistently favor your outcome over what a more cautious opening position would have produced. Never split the difference, always find a better solution. The fifth and final lesson is the one that gives the book its title and its most important strategic insight. Splitting the difference feels like a fair, reasonable, adult way to resolve a negotiation. It is also almost always a terrible outcome for both sides. When you split the difference, you are not finding the best solution available. You are finding the midpoint between 2 arbitrary positions, neither of which may reflect the actual value of what is being exchanged. Voss argues that a skilled negotiator can almost always find a creative solution that serves both sides better than the mathematical midpoint, if they are willing to invest the time and the empathy to find it. The discipline this lesson demands is the courage to resist the social pressure of compromise and the patience to keep searching for a genuinely better solution. When someone pushes you toward splitting the difference, respond with a calibrated question rather than an agreement. What if we looked at this differently? How could we structure this in a way that actually works for both of us? Those questions invite creative problem solving that splitting the difference permanently forecloses. The negotiator who never splits the difference is not being difficult, they're being excellent. The vault closing. What Chris Voss built with this book is something that most negotiation literature never attempts, a complete system for human influence grounded not in theory, but in the most pressure-tested environment imaginable. The techniques in this book were developed in situations where the cost of failure was measured in lives, refined across decades of the highest-stakes conversations a human being can have, and then validated in every business and personal negotiation context where they were applied. That pedigree is not just impressive. It is the reason these tools work when the polished frameworks of academic negotiation consistently fail. Here is your one specific action for the next 7 days. Identify one negotiation or difficult conversation coming up this week, whether it is a salary discussion, a contract renewal, a pricing conversation, or a personal boundary that needs to be set. Prepare 3 calibrated questions for it. Commit to labeling the other person's emotional state at least once in the first 5 minutes, and resist the urge to make your case until you have demonstrated that you genuinely understand theirs. One conversation handled with these tools will teach you more about negotiation than reading about it ever could. The Book Vault exists to give you the kind of strategic intelligence that changes how you negotiate, lead, and build the financial and professional life you are capable of. If this analysis gave you even one tool that will shift your next negotiation in your favor, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Book Vault, and drop your biggest takeaway in the comments below. Share this with someone who is leaving money, opportunity, or influence on the table in their negotiations. The Vault is always open for those serious about gaining a genuine, unfair advantage in every high-stakes conversation they will ever have,